Revolutions Per Minute is a weekly radio show from the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, recorded live at WBAI 99.5 in Brooklyn every Tuesday at 5. RPM is about doing the work to build a democratic socialist future. Every week, hear the latest news, analysis, and organizing experience from the minds and hearts of activists fighting every day in NYC. Join the movement at Socialists.nyc.
New York is in a housing crisis, but 2019 presents a rare opportunity to turn the tide, ending evictions, homelessness, and to fight the power of abusive landlords. This #Tenant Tuesday, RPM sits down with activists on the front lines of the fight for housing justice. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on WBAI, a socialist radio show and podcast from members of New York City Democratic Socialists of America. First, we'll be covering headlines with a socialist analysis, and then we'll be talking about the flourishing fight for housing justice in NYC. In the studio, we have Sia Weaver from the nyc-dsA Steering Committee and Donnelly Rodriguez from the Queens branch of nyc-dsA, who will be weighing in on this important issue. As always, the last quarter of the show is dedicated to you, the audience, to hear your perspective on the fight for socialism in New York City. But first, the headlines. Every week on Revolutions Per Minute, we like to share some of the most interesting headlines from NYC-DSA's weekly news digest, The Thorn, which you can sign up to receive in your inbox every Monday morning at www.thethorn.nyc. Perhaps the biggest headline this week is that Amazon is not coming to New York. Everyone who participated on any level in the No Amazon campaign should count this as a personal victory, as well as a victory for our collective altruism. This great news is proof once again that the people really do have the power. And perhaps the most important headline this week, as far as the subject of today's RPM, housing justice, is concerned, is that New York City Council members have proposed a bill that would limit brokers' fees and security deposits to 1 month of rent. And for our last few headlines for today, just to show how our people power not only makes waves with the powers that be, but puts us in position to create real change, a few updates regarding current DSA candidates and holders of public office. Julia Salazar, state senator for the 18th District in Bushwick, as well as an active and actively supported member of NYC-DSA, has published an op-ed in the influential policy blog City and State New York calling for comprehensive statewide campaign finance reform that would seek to limit the influence of dark money in elections by lowering maximum contribution limits and setting up a system of public campaign financing based on the system we are currently lucky to have, in which public funds would be available to match small dollar donations to candidates. Head over to City and State to check out that op-ed, as well as an interview with Julia in which she confirms that housing justice remains her main priority in this session of the legislature. There's also a great video interview with Senator Salazar up on the Real News Network from February 18th, in which she gives an update on how the universal rent control legislation she is working on in Albany is progressing politically.
So I introduced the bill less than 2 weeks ago. And so far, I've received really positive reception. I think that people are aware that we can't continue to do the same thing that we've always done. We can't continue to just allow landlords and the real estate lobby to do whatever they'd like. Legislators are seeing the harm that this is causing their communities. And I think additionally, after this recent election cycle, legislators at least Democratic legislators, are really emboldened. We know that when New Yorkers demonstrate that they need something and that they want something, as the housing justice movement is demonstrating to us right now, that we have an obligation to respond.
How great is that to hear? Just a couple more quick updates. The first one, a follow-up, a fruition of something we discussed on the last episode of RPM I hosted on electoral power in January, which is that Tiffany Caban, the experienced Queens public defender who is running and has received NYC-DSA's endorsement as the only actually progressive Democratic Socialist candidate for the important office of Queens District Attorney, has done some important interviews about her views and policies and strategies for winning office that our listeners might want to check out at the Queens Chronicle and the New York Post. This kind of coverage is a good sign at this early stage in a crowded race that she is getting attention and an opportunity to get her singular message out there. So do check her out to learn more. Tiffany Caban for Queen's DA. And finally, I think every DSA member and DSA sympathizer, every working class New Yorker, bar none for that matter, listening to this show today will want to hear about a final shocking yet unsurprising piece of news that you can find in this week's issue of The Thorn at www.thethorn.nyc. Yes, it will perhaps come as no surprise to learn that apparently officials in the New York State Democratic Party are allegedly plotting to eliminate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's congressional district in the redistricting that will occur after the 2020 census. You can read more about this nefarious scheme in Aida Chavez's article at The Intercept, linked to via The Thorn, and read about even more nefarious machinations afoot, or a squirm, in the New York City and State Democratic Party in the current issue and every issue of The Thorn, which will quickly confirm that we can't stop, won't stop until the people have the power. So holler at a comrade when you see us in these tweets. And finally, in breaking news as of this morning, happy super snow moon, everyone. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders announced his candidacy for the presidency of the United States, running as a Democrat, making his case for a campaign based on the work of active volunteers and a vision of social justice forcefully within the first minute of his 10-minute address.
Hi, I'm Bernie Sanders. I'm running for president, and I'm asking you today to be part of an unprecedented grassroots campaign of 1 million active volunteers in every state in our country. Our campaign is not only about defeating Donald Trump, the most dangerous president in modern American history. It is not only about winning the Democratic nomination and the general election. Our campaign is about transforming our country and creating a government based on the principles of economic, social, racial, and environmental justice. Our campaign is about taking on the powerful special interests that dominate our economic and political life. I'm talking about Wall Street, the health insurance companies, the drug companies, the fossil fuel industry, the military-industrial complex, the private prison industry, and the large multinational corporations that exert such an enormous influence over our lives. Our campaign is about redoubling our efforts to end racism, sexism, homophobia, religious bigotry, and all forms of discrimination. Our campaign is about creating a vibrant democracy with the highest voter turnout of any major country on earth, while we end voter suppression, Citizens United, and outrageous levels of gerrymandering. Our campaign is about creating a government and economy that works for the many, not just the few.
If you're interested in getting more information about organizing for Bernie with Democratic Socialists of America, follow at nyc-dsa and at Dem Socialists on Twitter. Our daily headlines are brought to you by The Thorn, an incredible weekly newsletter by NYC-DSA Electoral Working Group covering local politics and radical activism. Subscribe at thethorn.nyc. And by the way, tidings of solidarity to the West Virginia teachers who just went on strike today to stop a terrible anti-teacher, school privatization, anti-organizing bill from passing the West Virginia legislature, and it worked. The bill was defeated. So great for the West Virginia teachers, and so great for the rest of us that people are continuing to use the labor protections and the rights to strike that we still have in this country. I'm your host, Johnny Sagan, a.k.a. Snowy Wilderness, today for Revolutions Per Minute on WBAI 99.5 FM in New York City. And I am here today to host a show about housing justice with our two guests, Sia Weaver from the NYC-DSA Steering Committee and Donnelly Rodriguez from the Queens branch of NYC-DSA. And the way we're going to start it off is we're each going to quickly give our little manifesto about housing justice. So here's mine. Housing, in my view, is really at the center of the struggle for socialism in New York City itself and all across the country and the world. The need for housing is something we share across all layers of the working class and indeed across all classes. And as the magnitude of the climate change crisis that it will take a Green New Deal to survive comes into focus, it becomes clear how much the struggle for socialism really is a struggle to save the earth as a place that can continue to function as a house for us and a house for all life. When we talk about the history of capitalism, the housing quote-unquote market was right there at the inception of capitalism's attempt to establish a market for all things. And because of the inelasticity of everyone's demand for housing, the housing market remains in so many ways at the center of capitalism's hold on our lives. And similarly, when we talk about the history of socialism, both in New York and the rest of the country, in the United States and abroad, the attempt to establish socialized housing is right there at the inception and the center of our socialist history and our ongoing vision of the future. And when we look at present conditions and talk about justice, social justice and environmental justice both, housing is one of the most powerful issues because it makes injustice more concrete and relatable for more people than other social conditions sometimes may. When someone's living conditions are plainly intolerable, nobody can say they can't relate. So that's my manifesto. I'd like to introduce my two wonderful guests now. Donnelly Rodriguez.
What's up, people? Shout out to Queens real quick.
Yes.
So, yeah, man, I just want to plug in real quick Amazon Victory for Queens. Shout out to Queens for that, and all the organizations and all the people that put in a grassroots effort in ousting Amazon. But, yeah, so housing is very real for me. You know, I right now my mother's living in an apartment with mold. You know what I'm saying? So this is about people in my community right now living in conditions that are deplorable. You know what I mean? And they don't have a say. They don't have any power in their homes. And this is a complete injustice. We need to start talking about housing as a human right. And we need to start thinking about ways that we can empower people in their neighborhoods, in our society, throughout all of America, in ways that will give them autonomy and direction in their homes and quality homes. So housing justice for me is about giving people the quality of life that they deserve in a moral society and giving them autonomy and power within that right.
Sia Weaver. We'll do manifestos first, then we'll talk about our community work next.
Okay, so my name is Sia Weaver, and I would say my housing manifesto here is that the fight for housing justice is a fight not just about it is a fight about the human right to housing, like you all talked about, and I want to sort of echo what everybody has already said, but I want to add that specifically as a socialist, I want to fight for renter justice in this movement. For too often and for too long, from redlining to gentrification, our affordable housing policy in this country has been about how we can make certain people homeowners, and that is at the exclusion of other people. And so to me, this fight for housing justice is a fight for renter justice and how we can fight for regular people, no matter if they rent, no matter if they own, to have control over the place that they live. And that means fighting austerity. That means fighting for universal rent control. And so that's my housing manifesto.
Excellent. And DSA is a movement of people, and it's a locally based movement. So I thought we would just quickly go around before we take our first station break and say our names and where we live and what organizations and institutions within DSA and the housing justice movement we're a part of, sort of quick bullet points. So I'm Johnny Sagan, a.k.a. Snowy Wilderness. That's my quote-unquote nom de guerre. You got to have a colorful name sometimes in the revolution, especially if you have a name like John, where there are like 30,000 other comrades with the same name. I live in central Brooklyn. This is my home branch area, catchment area that we're broadcasting from. I'm in the central Brooklyn branch, and I've focused my work in DSA on contributing the stuff that I have to give, which is my journalism, my literature, my creativity, my learning. So I've done a lot of stuff with education and now broadcasting in the DSA, and that's what I do in my everyday life. Donnelly, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Just to echo my name one more time, is Donnelly Rodriguez. I'm from Astoria. You know, I lived in Astoria my entire life. I went to public schools out there. My parents are living there. My family still lives there. I still live there. Just to set the record straight, because some people were claiming I was from Connecticut, but that's a little crazy. But anyways, moving forward. Yeah, so I'm part of the Queens DSA. I do some work between the Housing Working Group and the Electoral Working Group. I'm also a CUNY School of Law student as well, and I'm also part of the Executive Steering Committee for the Justice for All Coalition, which is a group of NYCHA members throughout Western Queens fighting for housing justice. So yeah, that's my personal anecdote.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sia Weaver. I'm on the steering committee of NYC-DSA. And as a steering committee member, I help to coordinate our different working groups and campaigns, including the campaign for universal rent control, which is a priority for NYC-DSA right now. Outside of that work, I'm the campaign coordinator for the Housing Justice for All Coalition, which is a statewide coalition of renter groups that are fighting for stronger tenant protections across New York State in 2019.
Excellent. You're listening to Revolution Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming at WBAI.org. Today we're talking about housing justice in New York City and beyond for 2019. There's more going on than you might expect. Can't stop, won't stop. The listener call-in line is 212-209-2877. And if you want to pledge to the WBAI pledge drive, which is going on right now, that number is 516-620-3602. Thanks very much. We are back going into our first topic for today, which is tenant organizing, injustice at NYCHA, and the current rent strikes that are going on right now. And to set the stage for this discussion and lead this part of the discussion, we're going to turn first to Donnelly Rodriguez.
Yeah. So just some clarity right now on the rent strike. It's a potential rent strike at this moment, so there have been no proceedings with an actual rent strike at the moment, but we're in talks about it with all intention to move forward with it if some of the deplorable conditions throughout NYCHA are not assessed immediately. So just to touch on some of the things that we've been doing recently. So through Justice for All Coalition, we are in the midst of a huge problem in Queensbridge, in Ravenswood, in Astoria. A lot of people are living with mold in their apartments. They're living with no heat, no hot water. They're currently don't have, secure doors in their homes. They have holes in the wall. There's leaking going on in the roofs. And this is happening writ large, and this is a huge injustice. So one of the things that Justice for All right now is doing is we're kind of canvassing the community. We're getting in touch with community members, having community meetings to kind of like survey the issues that the NYCHA residents are experiencing right now, so that we can kind of create a paper trail. And there's actually a process called the HP Action, Housing Preservation Action, which allows NYCHA tenants and also all tenants throughout New York City to file essentially a lawsuit against their landlords for grievances for these particular issues. So what we're doing right now is organizing these people with the effort of moving towards filing HP actions in mass, so that we can kind of put pressure on the courts to respond to this issue. So with that said, we're hoping that once we file these HP actions, we can get some press around the issue. We can get some, galvanization. We can galvanize other NYCHA residents who are facing this issue and don't know that they have a right to a grievance around these issues. So the idea is that we need to put power in the hands of the people. We've been lobbying elected officials for years, trying to appeal to politicians in the state legislature and throughout city council. And honestly, they've been disinvesting in NYCHA for years. And it's largely based in, racism and classism. And these are things that we need to acknowledge. And the goal here is to now circumvent that process of having to depend on elected officials and politicians, and really root the power in people, in grassroots organizing, in base building. And when people recognize that the power is really in their hands, when they put pressure on various systems of institutions of government, this is what happens. We see change. And we saw that, last week when Amazon backed out of Queens because of the grassroots mobilization on the ground. So it's a huge victory. So the next step after this HP action process, if we're not able to see some fixes to the conditions that people are facing right here and right now, then the idea is to start thinking about withholding rent. And there's a legitimate legal defense to withholding rent. So what NYCHA will do, it would basically put individuals in a place to get evicted, but there's a legitimate defense if you have grievances and a paper trail behind it, and the defense is called a warranty of habitability, and that allows people who have these issues at home to say, hey, look, y'all haven't fixed this issue yet, and this is why the rent is not being paid. So in many cases, judges are able to issue rent abatements, either to 50%, even downwards to $0. So now we're hitting them where it hurts, in their budgets. And the idea is, if we can put that type of economic pressure on these institutions of government, we can get some restorative justice here, restorative justice against the racism that has justified the disinvestment in public housing throughout New York City, the classism, rooted in the disinvestment in NYCHA. So that's really what we're about right now, and rooting the power in people, everyday people taking direct action. This is direct action. This is civil disobedience. This is what Martin Luther King spoke about in his time during the civil rights movement. Sometimes we have to disobey unjust policies, and this is a measure if the governments aren't willing to, assess the situation.
And I have two questions for you that are somewhat related. One, just to be clear, what is the defense that the landlord, in this case the New York City Housing Authority, gives for the neglect of living conditions in NYCHA housing? And two, with the experience that you have organizing on behalf of NYCHA tenants' interests, when you bring that to your involvement in Queens DSA, what is the relationship that you see between DSA tenant organizing and what the coalition is working on in the community in Queens?
So to your first question, so I haven't personally filed any grievances with NYCHA, but I have filed grievances against my mother's building, which is a Section 8 building that is owned by Wavecrest Management, last I gathered, if they haven't switched management in a way to kind of like dwarf accountability, which happens a lot. We were able to get the landlord to be like, okay, we're going to come fix this. My mom has mold, and they never came. And they sent people and they asked for signatures, but nothing was actually done with regard to the molding concern. With respect to your second question, so can you ask it again real quick?
Yeah, just when you come to the DSA meetings, you're part of a broader coalition in Queens. Yeah. How do you interface your Queens community organizing experience with the DSA, and how does the DSA respond?
It's about centering racial justice. I'm going to keep it a buck with you, man. It's really about centering racial justice. The reality of DSA right now, the makeup is predominantly, white people. And, like, I'm a person of color. I'm a black Latino, you feel me, Dominican, first generation. So, like, a lot of people of my background aren't really in a position to even, like, be in law school and know about these issues and be be before DSA spaces because they got other shit they got to deal with. So like for me, what I'm doing is I'm centering racial justice and sending a message to my comrades throughout DSAs that we need your bodies. We need your efforts. We need your resources. We need y'all to come through and stand in solidarity with the people of Queens and people of color throughout the nation. That's really what it's about, because a lot of the times many of us are already in vulnerable situations. So, you know, even myself, even putting myself at the front lines, being a law student who I have to pass the, you know, the character and fitness portion. If I get arrested, I gotta justify that to a racist system. So like it's really just about centering the racial justice and how it connects to classism and how we can build a solidarity through, you know, class struggle and race struggle.
In the community, Goosebumps, that's the perfect transition to our next recorded segment, which is an interview with DSA member Matt about his experience with tenant organizing.
So my name is Matt, and I live in Harlem. Like a lot of people, I joined DSA after the election because I was looking for a more aspirational form of politics. I initially joined because I wanted to find a place to plug in, and it really wasn't until I got this major capital improvement notice from DHCR, the state housing agency, for my building and researched what it was, you know, an increase in rent for all the rent stabilized tenants in the building, that I started to kind of buckle down and pick an area where I was like, all right, I'm going to go to the housing working group meetings. I'm going to reach out to DSA folks and see what resources they have to connect me to so I can figure out how to organize my building. And I had never done anything like that before. So I was really, really nervous. You know, it was just, I saw something that was going on that didn't seem right and that was going to negatively impact a lot of people. It took a lot of conversations. It took a lot of asking, is this going to be okay? And it took a lot of research. But luckily, DSA resources connected me to various community organizations. It was kind of like one thing led to another and that sort of thing, you know, how everything branches out like that. So we just kind of took the plunge and went door knocking, and I learned that half the units in my building had been deregulated since this new management company, like 10 years ago or whatever, bought the building. So it seemed like there was this sort of systemic deregulation of units going on. And we organized the first Tenants Association meeting at kind of a safer place, the borough president's office, Gail Brewer's office. And I had no idea who was going to show up. And the turnout was really big. Like, it was much bigger than what I expected. I mean, it was unfortunate to hear about all the problems that everyone in the building had been having over the years, like with lack of repairs and harassment and overcharges and buyouts and all these different things. But, you know, it was very clear that our building needed an organizing force to bring people together around these central causes that were affecting everybody. Whether the people knew it in the market rate units know it or not, it affects them. You know, they don't get the notices from DHCR, but their rent goes up because the landlord can just decide to increase the rent. Like, that's just how it goes. Yeah, we started doing that, and we were having monthly meetings. It wasn't too long until we started to notice that the landlord was changing his tune. Like, he started fixing things. He started treating people with kindness instead of yelling at them. After you do it, you realize that it's, you know, yeah, like sometimes you can feel in over your head about it, but you kind of realize that it actually doesn't take a heck of a lot to steer things in the right direction. And so it felt really good to not only see everyone participating, but know that had an immediate impact. On a very basic level, it's really good to know your neighbors. You know, like, you really feel a greater sense of community and but also too, like, we've got each other's backs, and that's like a really, really great thing. Really, what it taught me about capitalism. It's like, if you don't really pay attention to what's going on politically, these moneyed interests will create situations that are incredibly hostile to basic existence, to the place where you live. You know, like, housing is a right. You know, we all believe that we have the right to live in good conditions. We all believe that, you know, we all need to be looking out for each other. Organizing together kind of joining forces against these moneyed interests, against those who threaten us, it's obviously a very inherently socialist thing. But whether people label themselves socialists or not, they value that connection. They value that someone who goes out and shows that they care. And I consider myself a socialist because, like I said, it is so positive and aspirational, and it's this belief that we should create a society that's equitable for all. And within that is your right to live, and your right to live peacefully and comfortably and have your neighbors to lean on.
So, tenant organizing, when we say the phrase, sounds a lot like worker organizing. What do you all think about that comparison? What are the similarities, differences, and common political strategy of the two, would you say?
So I think that there's a lot of similarities. It's true that when people come together, they can fight back against corporate power, whether it's landlord corporate power or employer corporate power. But I think one of the things that's critically different right now between tenant organizing and I think what Matt's story showed is that you can win like real material gains when tenants rise up against landlords, similar to when workers rise up against their employer. What's sort of different for tenants right now, and for too many tenants in New York City, is that, in New York State rather, is that 5.5 million tenants basically don't really have any rights to stay in their home at all. That means that they don't have the right to renew a lease. It means they don't have the right to ask for repairs. It means that their landlord, because he like quote unquote owns the building, has like full control over that unit. And so one of the challenges of tenant organizing right now compared to worker organizing is that it's really difficult to win direct gains from landlords when landlords have full retaliatory power to just evict you. And so right now in our fight for universal rent control, we are tenant organizing to actually strengthen tenants' legal rights so that they can stay in their home and that they can fight for some of these like material gains. Like workers won the right to bargain, right? That was something that workers fought for in history. They won the right to like have unions that are recognized by employers. We're trying to do something similar with tenant organizing right now.
And within tenant organizing, how do we build that power beyond just pursuing legal changes?
So beyond just pursuing changes to the law, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's lots of different things that you can do. One thing that I like to look to is the history of the tenant movement in New York in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, and even the 1990s, where tenants were actually both like worker movements were building like like unions were building cooperative housing, right? But also tenants were working to take over housing themselves, and that's happening, into this day. But critically, it's happening into this day, and in order for, and we'll talk about this later in the show, I think, but without some sort of like investment from the state that makes sure that the housing is deeply affordable, it becomes an unsustainable model. So I think when we talk about like tenant power over our homes, we're really talking about two things. One, we're talking about that someone's right who lives in a home to have self-determination in that home. And then the second thing is we're talking about affordability. And if you can't afford it, the state should be stepping in to make sure that you can. And if it's not being repaired, the state should be stepping in to make sure it's repaired. So we're talking about both like no matter how much you can afford to pay, your housing should be there for you, and it should be safe. And if you live there, you should have a say in what it looks like. And that's really what I think we're talking about when we talk about universal rent control and we talk about tenants' rights to fight for their homes.
Absolutely. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to a quirk of the history of tenant organizing and housing practices in New York City, which was that for literally hundreds of years, there was a tradition called moving day, where everyone in the city who was renting their accommodation would move on the same day what day was it? May 1st. On May 1st every year. And there were complex reasons for this, but what it did have the effect of doing was keeping a kind of crude balance between tenants and landlords' interests for those hundreds of years, in that nobody was locked into a multiple-year lease. No landlord could depend on a multiple-year lease. And these were not luxury condos, let me tell you, that were being exchanged on May 1st. But that was how hard our ancestors literally worked and broke their backs to retain some sort of negotiating power against landlords in New York City back then. So with that blast from the past, you're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming at WBAI.org. Today we're talking about housing justice in New York City and beyond for 2019. There's more going on than you might expect. Can't stop, won't stop. And we want you to call us at 212-209-2877. That's 212-209-2877 for the listener conversation we're going to have later in the show. And the question of the day today is, please let us know what you're excited about with regard to housing justice reform in New York, and what is your socialist vision for housing? So we just uttered the powerful words universal rent control, and that's the subject of the second half of our show. Universal rent control is a really crucial set of reforms of the New York State rent laws that we are campaigning for in DSA, as those laws draw closer to being up for renewal in June of this year. We want to start this segment off by playing some audio from our conversation with Michael Kavadius, a DSA member active in tenant organizing and universal rent control in Manhattan.
I'm hopeful this year because we have a new legislature. We defeated a lot of really bad people in primaries and the general election last year, especially in the state Senate. We've never had the chance before to not have Republicans controlling the agenda in the state Senate and blocking all of these things. There's a whole movement behind all the improvements that we want to make to these laws, and I've seen how the tenants in these buildings I live in have worked together, and I'm hopeful that we can get some good changes that will help people be able to afford to stay in their homes and help make New York more affordable in general. I'm also hopeful because if we pass the laws that we want to pass and we bring all these apartments back into regulation, the next time the tenants in my building organize, it won't just be 4 tenants, it'll be all 22 units that will be rent stabilized, and we'll have ability to have more solidarity. And that will be true in buildings all across the city.
And now, Sia Weaver, will you please discuss for us the universal rent control campaign that is going on now?
Totally, I would love to. So like Michael said, we have a really important moment in the state legislature right now. So rent regulation and sort of landlords' right to charge rent in the state is typically dealt with in Albany, which means when we talk about tenants' rights, we're talking about strengthening them with the governor, the state legislature, and not necessarily our mayor. So what universal rent control, and so every so often, tenants' rights sort of sunset in Albany. That means that, like, your right to a renewal lease will expire. And the reason why the state legislature does this is because they want the real estate industry to come back to them and pay more attention to them. There is more real estate money in politics than any other single industry in New York State. And so it's really important for our corrupt state legislature to force the real estate industry to come back to them every so often. So this year, rent regulations are expiring in Albany, and we really see that as our leverage to not only renew the state regulations, which is what has been happening for many years, but to renew them, strengthen them, and expand them. So our fight for universal rent control is about a number of things. It's about strengthening tenants' rights in the way that they've been broken. So since 1997, the landlord lobby has poked our tenant rights framework full of so many loopholes that even if you have some basic tenants' rights, your landlord can still push on you a massive rent increase. Your landlord can still harass you out of your home. So the first component of universal rent control is strengthening rights for the 2.5 million New Yorkers who currently have them. There are another 5.5 million New York renters who currently don't have any rights at all. That means their landlord can cease their lease at any time. It means that their landlord can raise their rent at any time. It means that it's very difficult for those tenants to stand up for things like to fight against their mold, like you described your mother having, mold. So the second two components of universal rent control are about how we expand a basic framework of renters' rights to every tenant, every person who rents their home in New York State. So the first is expanding rent stabilization to all of New York State's renters. Right now, rent stabilization only applies to New York City and the 3 surrounding counties, Nassau, Rockland, and Westchester. We want rent stabilization to apply to every single county in New York State.
Goosebumps.
Oh, yeah.
And then the second thing is that rent stabilization only applies to buildings with 6 or more units built before 1974, which exempts a whole lot of housing. So we want to pass a good cause eviction law that would give every single tenant in New York State, even those who live in small buildings, even those who live in new buildings, even those who rent in manufactured homes, so trailer parks. All of those people should have the same right to a renewal lease that a rent-stabilized tenant has. So our good cause eviction bill would make sure that those tenants have the right to a renewal lease so their landlord can't force retaliatory evictions on them. And we know that a right to a renewal lease, but your landlord raising your rent $500, $600, $700 is as good as an eviction. So we would also, in this bill, limit rent increases to 1.5% of the consumer price index, which would stop landlords from being able to unnecessarily jack rent on any apartment in New York City. So that's our plan.
And just quickly, DSA is canvassing for this plan. Can you describe for our listeners a little bit how that campaign's working?
Yeah, so what we are doing is we are door knocking in critical state senate and state assembly districts across the city and the state. So if you are really inspired by making sure that your neighbors can fight gentrification, and I should say that this kind of anti-displacement policy is critical to fighting gentrification, you should get involved. And you can email Socialists@nyc. Every single Tuesday, we have people knocking on doors in key state senate and state assembly districts, making sure that that the constituents of people who are standing in our way or who should be stronger champions know that that's going on.
So exciting. So for the next segment of the show, we're kind of going to get into the ultimate vision of the universal rent control movement, looking even further than the June deadline. We're going to talk about a socialist vision for housing. Once again, I will share my inflammatory opinions and say that I would rather be supported by the state to own my apartment and manage it with my neighbors as part of a co-op than to support my landlord's business. So we're going to open the caller lines now at 212-209-2877 for listeners to discuss these big picture visions with us. Thank you. We've got a caller on the line now, in fact. Hello, can you hear me?
Hello?
Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm calling from Adam Mermelstein building, Treetop Development. He bought all these buildings all over the city. Here in Flushing, he bought 8 buildings. He's pushing out all the tenants out of these rental control buildings. He just bought one in Far Rockaway, which is 916 units, and he's doing the same thing. Construction has been going on for 3 years. Is there any way you could leave a contact so I can send you the information?
Absolutely.
Hey, this is Sia. I think we actually talked on the radio last week. You can email me at TENANTS at Socialists.nyc. And I will say that we have been fighting treetop management across New York City. I completely hear what you're saying. They are a horrible predatory evictor, and they want to get rent-stabilized tenants out of their buildings, and we want to fight them with you. So please email me, and you can also call me. I'll just give everyone on the radio my phone number.
Let's get it.
It's 585-315-0826, and I really look forward to talking to you more.
Thank you so much for that call. We've got a little bit of time left to discuss the future, to discuss big picture issues. So I'll ask both Donnelly and Sia, looking at June and beyond, looking at the ultimate vision of the universal rent control campaign and the ultimate vision for socialist housing, what is your vision and what is your hope for the future with regard to the kinds of housing rights and kinds of housing amenities we could potentially enjoy under socialism?
Yeah, so I actually want to speak to, just the opportunity that we have here to establish, people power in the process of moving towards this, socialist vision of housing justice and what it looks like in the future. We're often caught up in the struggle of trying to effectuate change through policy measures, and that's super important. And I applaud all individuals who are in solidarity in that struggle. And I think sometimes we also have to, take a step back and also take into consideration what we're building in the process of effectuating these social changes with respect to housing. So I think that right here we're presented with a very unique opportunity on the left to really start galvanizing communities, to really start getting people to build a greater sense of community through housing justice. And it's a very basic need, the one to have a space where you can feel secure, where you can live a life happily. And when you're able to connect with others around that, I think that very process presents an opportunity to start building popular power in our communities, to set up the structures that are integral to holding institutions accountable, to holding neighbors accountable to one another, and making sure that we're building a society that promotes equity in housing justice and quality in housing justice.
Absolutely. I think you're striking a nerve. We've got callers on the line. Caller, this is WBAI. Revolutions per minute on WBAI. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. My name is Arnold. I'm from Southeast Queens.
Hi.
And I agree with a lot of things you're saying, because we need a total, not only reform, but a revolution of how the housing is being... Huh?
I said here.
Oh, yes. Where the housing is being implemented basically against working class and poor people. Because, we're supposed to be the superpower, but the average person who's working 2-3 jobs can't afford to rent an apartment by themselves. And that's really a crime against humanity. So basically, I know a couple of people in Southeast Queens. We're trying to prevent what people call gentrification, but we call it ethnic cleansing, because basically,
let's call it what it is.
They're trying to uproot the people and probably put them through the homeless system, where, hate to say it, a lot of these oligarchical elitists are making a lot of money off the shelter system. And our position is that, hell no, we're not going anywhere. But one of the things I want to know is that do you have workshops on how we can better organize and try to prevent this from happening?
Thanks for bringing that up.
Because I'm interested in going to a workshop on how to better organize to prevent from these people from rooting us out about our community.
Yes, and the good news is that we do. Thank you so much for your call.
Yeah, so as a part of the Queens DSA, we have monthly meetings, and we're really trying to get as many people out there as possible who are facing these issues. Our next Queens DSA meeting is actually on Wednesday, February 20. Give me a second here just to confirm. The 27th? Yep. So February 27th, Queens DSA. It's in Jackson Heights. Do you have the address?
And to our caller, we would love to have you and your neighbors and your friends and your family come to the DSA and fellowship with us.
Yeah, and one of the things we're talking about at this meeting while we pull up the address is we are talking about our fight to kill the deal at Amazon HQ 2 and why that deal was really a deal that was pushed by the real estate industry, why it was a fight against real estate, and how you could get involved in making sure that the real estate industry continues to lose in New York.
Yeah, so we got the details for you. So again, it's the address is 3762 89th Street, Elmhurst, 11372. All right, so we appreciate it if you come so that we can continue to fight against ethnic cleansing in our neighborhoods.
On your behalf and all of our behalf. And we're definitely on a hot button issue today. We've got another caller on the line on WBAI. Hello, caller.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good. My name's Cap Rusler, and I'd love to talk more about pilot payment in lieu of taxes.
Yes, please.
Which goes directly to what you guys were just talking about, and it happens in everywhere throughout New York State. I live in Westchester, and we have an affordable housing crisis also. We are the second largest growing county outside of New York, and our developers are getting huge tax abatements and not paying their fair share into the system, making it harder for working families to have access to live and work in the same place.
Thank you so much. It's not just a New York City thing by any means.
It is not just a New York City thing, and this pilot problem happens across New York State, like you said. And one of the things that we are trying to do with our universal rent control campaign is hold New York's real estate industry accountable to the need to provide actually sustainable and affordable rental housing. And there is too much in New York State developers who are getting paid through either the 421A tax abatement program or the pilot tax abatement program to build basically state subsidized gentrification is like sort of how I like to think about really what it is the state is subsidizing developers to come into neighborhoods and build housing that's unaffordable to existing communities. That's happening in Westchester, it's happening in Nassau County, it's happening in New York City and across the state. And so we would love to fight these corporate welfare policies with you.
Thank you, Sia. Thank you, Donnelly. Thank you to all of our callers. Your passion is our passion. Your pain is our pain. I wanted to recap by focusing on actions that listeners can take if they want to get involved in Brooklyn and Queens, in New York City, and across the state. So I wanted to give the last couple of minutes to Donnelly and Sia to tell us about actions and partner organizations that people could plug into.
Yeah, so definitely just want to rebump the Queens DSA meeting that's happening on February 26th. Again, 27th, sorry, February 27th. What's actually happening on February 26th is there's going to be some canvassing going on at the polls for Tiffany Caban, who's running for district attorney in Queens.
God knows.
Yes. So shout out to Tiffany for fighting for racial justice and criminal justice reform for real. But yes, and secondly, I'm going to put a shameless plug to myself. You can also follow me on Twitter at DR0DRIGUEZ. That's D Rodriguez with a 0 in the O, and you can follow me for updates with the Justice for All Coalition. We're going to be have community meeting coming up this month. We haven't set the date, but look forward to that. Also, check us out on Facebook at the Queens DSA Facebook page. Just search Queens DSA, and it'll get you plugged in with our meetings and our general events.
Cool. So like I said, rent stabilization is expiring in New York on June 15th, 2019, and so we have a lot to do between now and then to make sure that renters' rights are not only renewed but passed to everybody. So today's Tuesday, which means it's hashtag Tenant Tuesday, and so every Tuesday we are taking action for renters' rights in New York State. So one thing you can do today is go to nyc-dsa's Twitter. It's at nyc-dsa. And retweet a video explaining what rent stabilization is and how it impacts New Yorkers and what you can do to strengthen it. So you should all go to our Twitter and retweet it, because I bet someone we wouldn't get 100 retweets. And right now we're at 77, so I really need you all to retweet it. And then the other thing you can do is you can come with us to Albany to fight for stronger tenants' rights. We go up every single Tuesday. You can call your state assembly person or your state senator and let them know that you believe in the fight for universal rent control. And if you want to know who your state assembly person or who your state senator is, you can contact me. I gave you my phone number. I'll give it to you again. And I'll give you my email. It's cweaver@tandn.org. You can call me at 585-315-0826. You can follow NYC-DSA on Twitter and Facebook. And you can visit www.housingjusticeforall.org and sign up to join our fight. And we really look forward to having you.
And speaking of Twitter, since we all know the tweets is watching, we are RPM Radio on WBAI, and we are on Twitter at NYCRPM. That's at NYCRPM. And a very special thanks to James Thayer for the new logo. And that's it. Another episode in the can of RPM Radio, the housing justice episode on WBAI, Tenant Tuesdays, February 18th, 19th, 2019. And let's give a round of applause for the DSA chorus closing out with an amazing gospel rendition of Solidarity Forever.
Yeah, shout out to Queens, no Amazon.
The union